I hope you're ready for this conversation. I feel like it's a conversation that needs to be had. And I've invited this beautiful woman to come and join me to have the conversation with me. Thank you so much for joining me, Annie.
I'm so excited to be here, Christine. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. When you reached out to be on the podcast, I felt so like aligned with you in a way that felt that you could bring some real grace and genuineness to the conversation.
Mm,
And I was willing to really approach you from a place of please share with me what I need to know in order to be better, right? Like when it comes
yeah,
to diversity and inclusion, it is a very uncomfortable conversation sometimes, yet it doesn't have to be. And I think that what you can bring to it will be really a mind opening space and
yeah,
an awareness for us to take responsibility where we can. Yeah.
absolutely, 100%. Can I just say, I have been listening to your podcast for a while now, probably a little bit over a year, and just love it. So when I approached you, it was very much from a place where I see us just chatting like friends, like just having a conversation about this and seeing it just flowing. So it feels really good to be doing this, Christine.
Oh, I'm so glad. And thank you so much for listening. It means the world. That's just lovely. Lovely to hear.
Yeah.
And I always do like to have that conversation, that kind of level of conversation with my guests, because I feel like that's what everyone listens for, right? It's not
Mm.
about a structured. So if anyone's,
Oh,
listening,
yeah.
I have core areas of where I want to go with a conversation, but I never have like a full structure of how every question after the next, because I'm really wanting to hear it from your point of view. And sometimes we're not really listening if we're thinking about the next question.
I get you. Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, so for those who don't follow you, don't know much about you, would you mind sharing us a little bit of background on what led you to become a DEI coach?
Yes, of course. So I came to Australia a little over 20 years ago as an international student. And the dream was to get into media, was studying mass communication. And I did that. And got offered work experience opportunity at one of the leading broadcasting, stations. I got it. I enjoyed it, but I couldn't see anyone who looked like me. I'm a Black migrant woman from Kenya originally, and I just couldn't see anyone who looked like me. And so I second guessed myself, Christine. I was like, how can I do this kind of public facing work, being a reporter, being in television? My accent back then was so much stronger, and I just felt like I didn't want to be in that kind of spotlight. And I just didn't feel like I belonged. So cut a long story short, got into HR. I went back to uni, studied, got a master's degree in human resource management, and did that for quite some time until I became a mom for the first time. So I'm a mom of two kids. And it was whilst I was on maternity leave the first time that I felt I really wanted to do something in the media space. And so I created a documentary series all about good news stories. And it got picked up for television broadcast in Australia, New Zealand, and eventually in my home country of Kenya. And it was
Awesome.
doing those stories that made me feel like there was a gap in telling our migrant stories of color because they are often told under the light and the idea of lack, poverty, illness,
Mm.
sickness, just that it's just synonymous with suffering. And that's not all that it is when it comes to Black people and people of color. So I felt the need to showcase that. So the storytelling changed a little bit and started spotlighting migrant women of color rising. And through that, we then witnessed the horrific public execution of George Floyd. And because I was right in it being a coach, so I've cut a lot out of my story. I did train to become a life coach with the beautiful You Coaching Academy. You mentioned you've had Julie Parker here on the program, so trained with them, and then I was supporting migrant women of color as a career and development coach. And from then, I just felt like there was a gap in our industry. There wasn't anybody that I knew who was a coach who was talking about, inclusion, representation, something that is really essential, especially given how multicultural Australia is. we are not seeing that translating in how business transactions are happening, and how for us in the coaching and personal development industry, we are not seeing that representation, Black, brown, indigenous, and people of color represented, be they coaches themselves or clients. And I saw that gap, and given my background in human resources and having supported different organizations, be it in the private sector or the public sector, with diversity and inclusion projects, I just saw a real gap, and I felt that I could feel that. And so that's how I ended up becoming a diversity, equity, and inclusion coach and consultant. And it has been received so positively because there hasn't been that thing, there hasn't been that education. And it is something that a lot of people are so hungry to learn. But on the converse side, Christine, is that there's a lot of fear of getting it wrong.
100%. You're so right. And I think that it just even becomes this fear of being even in the uncomfortable position of having the conversation,
Yes.
right? To even address, like we were saying before I hit record, like even just address our own privilege and
Mm,
recognize how we've benefited from our own privilege, to recognize how other people have not benefited from that, right? Like,
yes.
I think it's really, and it can be an uncomfortable conversation. And I think there's also opportunity for us to grow through this experience and become more inclusive because, I mean, you're right. Like, Australia is supposed to be this multicultural country, yet there is still so much division and so much racism. And yet, if we're being front and center, like I think, like if we're speaking directly to business owners, if we are being front and center and we're being open with the way that we're presenting ourselves online, on websites, like all of that, we have to recognize that and bring that into it, right? Like there's so much that goes into it.
Absolutely, absolutely. When I work with a lot of coaches and creatives and consultants, the key thing here is, Annie, I keep attracting people who just look like me. I keep attracting a lot of white clients. And how do I make my business more diverse? What am I doing wrong? And the thing is, it's not that you're particularly doing anything wrong. It's just that you're not even aware of the implicit bias that you hold. You've always partaken of a certain narrative, and so how you present, how you speak, the kind of language that you use is calling in a certain kind of client. And when you think about, when we learn about attracting clients and our like the what do they call it, ideal client avatar, what do they look like, how do they sound, where do they shop, what do they eat, how old are they, we are really thinking of somebody who looks like us.
Yeah.
We're really thinking of maybe a younger version of ourselves, that now we are ahead of the game a little bit, we can support them as a coach. And so you end up in an unknowing way, unconsciously excluding people of color from the equation. And it's when you begin to look at things not so much from demographics or those things that we've been told are important, but starting to look at them from a values based perspective, more to do with psychographics, what are the things that matter to this person, that connect me to this person, that I can be of service to and of value to, then the game changes. But it does take time to begin to look at things from that perspective, and to incorporate inclusive language, language that allows people who have been excluded historically and for a long time to begin to feel comfortable when they're having a conversation with you. They're like, hey, I think this person is very aware that there's an imbalance, because the issue normally is the lack of knowing. Like, I didn't even know this was an issue. But when you speak to somebody who is quite aware, the language is different. How they approach you, how they speak to you is different. And so that is something that I teach. And with time, you begin to see people's language and ways and behavior begins to change.
Yeah. You're so right. And I think it also has to do with, like, yes, that we look or we market to clients that look like us or who are similar to us years ago. We also look for mentors and who we learn from that look like us, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things, like when with George Floyd and everything that happened with Black Lives Matter, when it first began, like, or when it was activated, I even was like, I literally went back and looked through all of my guests from my podcast. I went and actually looked at my following on my social media, and I was like, I get it. Like, I'm seriously like, um, not so what's the word, like programming or conditioning
Yeah.
myself for more white privilege, right? Because I'm learning just from white people, and it's like that's not
Mhm.
serving inclusivity. It's serving even me in any way, shape, or form. Because if I keep taking on head mindsets or belief systems from people just like me, that's not going to change anything, right? So,
Absolutely. You
yeah.
know, it's even when you look at it from other forms of diversity, for example, gender, if you're only learning from women or potentially only learning from men, say in the corporate arena, there's a certain narrative that you're missing out on. If you're learning from people who are just, heterosexual, and you're not learning from people who hold other non-binary identities, you will always look at things from one lens, and it doesn't, and in so doing, you're not including people who you could potentially be serving, people who are ready to be served by you, but you don't even know how to do that because you've been looking at it from a very different lens.
Mm. I remember listening to a podcast, and I can't remember the person's name, to be honest. But it was honestly like mind blowing. The whole podcast. I'll have to put the link in the show notes. I'll find it because it was with the Man Enough podcast by Justin Baldani, and it was this incredible conversation around someone who saw themselves as non-binary, and the way that they described their sexuality or the way that they described their vision for themselves was so phenomenal that it literally came back to, let's be human connecting to another human, and we're all love. Like, it was just phenomenal. I need to share it with everyone, so I'll put that in the show notes. But um it was so, you're so right in the way that when you start to re-educate yourself and you take on other views and you see so much more out there in the world, and you understand from different people's points of view, because I think that the basis of coaching, right, is understanding that we all have our own map of the world, right? We all have different life experiences and belief systems and culture and religion and everything that goes into making us who we are. And we have that creates then a filter that we are walking around this world with, and so that shapes then what we see and what we bring into our existence. And I think that when you start to open up that worldview and you start to allow yourself to see other perspectives, that's true living. Like, that's true culture. Like, I feel like I've always been fascinated with human beings right from the beginning of my employment journey, right? Always just been fascinated with different cultures. And I worked on cruise ships when I was like 21 for many years, and just loved all the different cultures that I got to know. And I have friends all over the world. And I feel like that's always spurred on my curiosity with it. And
Yeah.
so, my point to my story is that after listening to this podcast, that just opened up my eyes, because I was curious, because I was like, I want to understand, because I recognized that I was being triggered by everyone starting to change their what are they called, their
Pronouns.
pronouns. That's right, I lost my words there. Started to
Yeah.
change their pronouns, and I was like, well, I'm not really sure if I want to put my pronouns up on my, and I was like, but why, like, why don't I, why am I being triggered by this?
Mhm.
And so I listened to this podcast, and I can't remember how I came across it, but it blew my mind so much that then I was talking to other friends and family friends, and I started to notice this real bias against it. Like, it was really interesting that, and I was like, you need to listen to this podcast. Like, you need to understand it. Like, you're judging this from your perspective, thinking that
Mhm.
yours is the only perspective.
Absolutely. And this is where, shifting from looking at it from a best practice perspective, because we've been very much indoctrinated to think what's best practice, particularly coming from a corporate background. What's best practice? This is how we do things. This is the best way. This is the professional way. Professional or best practice according to who? Like,
Yes.
who set the rules, especially when you think of, bringing it back to race, when you think of what is deemed professional in the workplace, having straight hair, and if you come in braids, as we normally do, people, women who are black, or even men or non-binary, if you have your hair in a different state than being straight or short and straight and it's afro, that is not deemed professional. In fact, if anything, it's deemed as being unkempt and somebody who is not taking care of themselves. But it really goes back to the system of who created the rules and who are the rules created for. Like, who did they have in mind to serve, to be of service to? Because if it was people who came from diverse backgrounds and that was acceptable, then we're looking at that from a human lens. It's not about best practice, it's about human practice.
Love
And
that.
that's what I teach a lot about. How can we begin to shift things from what we have been historically told, this is the way, this is the way, but according to whose way, who made those rules? If we just humanize the experience for everybody, then we're doing a better job of trying to include all of us in, rather than saying a certain select, this is the right way. And that's when we lead into the superiority and the glorifying of one particular culture that we look up to and say that's what we aspire to. But we are excluding by doing that.
Yeah. And who says they're better? Like, yeah, interesting. So, for those who might be listening, that this is probably might be the first thought of, okay, so if as a business owner, what can I do to become more of an ally? What can I do to become more inclusive? What would you say would be the first focus?
The first focus, Christine, is to educate yourself. Begin to find material that you can just chew on, begin to study, and maybe something that piques your interest. If it's something to do with like what we've discussed about, human lens and looking at things from a perspective of maybe professionalism and why certain things have been told to be this is the correct way and this is not. Maybe whatever piques your curiosity, start from there. And the thing is, there are so many resources available. In fact, it's overwhelming. But one of the ways that I love to consume content is podcasts. One of yours being one of the ones in my library, and just putting on my AirPods if it's my morning walk, which I haven't done because it's winter. But as I am multitasking and doing different activities, that's one way for me to consume information, and that's how I squeeze in my DEI work as well, hearing and learning from different people from all around the world. And it's a good way for you to begin to consume this in a way that is not overwhelming, but it is consistent. Something, a new episode drops, you're listening to that. And what happens is that with time, you begin to become curious, you question things. So it all starts by educating yourself. And so that's just one example. And there are many other things in terms of, socially thinking, okay, it's Wednesday night or it's Friday night, we want to watch a movie. Being intentional. Maybe today we'll watch a movie that has a lot more diversity than just white folks. Maybe we'll watch something that's just, maybe we'll watch Bridgerton and just, appreciate seeing people from different cultures and backgrounds. And it might begin with as little as that. But with time, what that is doing is beginning to normalize
Mm.
seeing different cultures and people from different backgrounds so that you're opening up your lens. That's where I'd say beginning from.
So, speaking of Bridgerton, because I found this super fascinating when I watched it as well, watched it many
Yes.
times, love it. I loved, and I remember having a conversation with one of my friends about this. I love how they've almost, Shonda is so amazing, how she's literally rewritten history in a way. Like, I just love it. It's just gone beyond, like, let's try to fix it. No, let's just rewrite it. Like, right?
Yeah.
Like, I just love how that she's created this space where you can in movies, right? And you can in TV to create this environment of like, well, hang on a minute, what if the Queen of England was black, right? Like, how amazing would that be? And how it changed the social constructs to a certain extent. But I'd love to know your opinion on it. Like,
I
what do
am
you
a
take away
huge
from it?
I'm a huge fan of Shonda Rhimes. I have loved her
Same.
since the days of Grey's Anatomy and
Scandal.
following her on to, Olivia Pope.
Yeah.
And I mean, she has Scandal. She's done a lot for television in opening us up
Mm.
and really bringing in that Black narrative and people of color. And so Bridgerton, I think, was such a needed show and how it's been depicted, and obviously going into the British Empire and the, the royalness of it all, I think is such a beautiful depiction, but also there's truth to it. So what is being shared there, there's a lot of truth, because there was a queen of color. There was. So this is not something that she's kind of just made up and just kind of added people of color in there. There was. That history does exist. And whilst a lot of it has been evolved and sort of made to match up current times and so on, there is a historical truth to
Mm,
what they are sharing. There is.
love it.
And here's the thing, this is history that we don't know about. These are things that were not taught to us,
Mm,
because blackness was not a thing. It wasn't ever shared or elevated in that way, particularly when we look at the British monarchy and so on. So I think Shonda is needed
yeah.
and appreciated. And when you look at the generation that we have now, the millennials and the generation alpha, they are so open to matters of inclusion, diversity. It's not like, the baby boomers who are just like, we had no clue. When I get people into my programs and people who are a little bit older, they're like, I grew up in a place where I didn't know I even had this way of thinking, this perceptions, these stereotypes. I honestly did not know I held these prejudices, but it goes back to upbringing, what I was exposed to, and the things that were taught to me.
Mm.
So this is needed, and the generations that are coming on now are catching on much, much faster, and they're not standing for injustice at all.
100%. I totally agree. Like, I grew up in a really small country town in Victoria, and everyone in my primary school that I can remember was white. Um, Maybe a couple part Aboriginal,
Yeah.
but yeah, like I'm just trying to think now. Um, but it's interesting because my niece and nephew go to a school in Melbourne City, and so multicultural. Like, it's amazing that he's like almost the like he stands out rather than the opposite, right? Like, it's so amazing. And you're right, like their attitude to it is that we are all the same, and we just have different mums and dads that think about different things, like, and have eat different foods. Like, it's actually
Mm,
not such a
mm.
big deal, or there's no emphasis on it, I guess, that
Yeah,
something's
it's
different.
the treating of people equally.
Yeah.
You're not treating somebody better because of the color of their skin. You're like, this is my friend. They do happen to be black, but there's no, I'm not better than them or they're not better than me. We are human beings.
Yeah, we're just friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is nice. I have to point out too, I recently watched a Netflix series with Chelsea Handler, and she does a whole like series on addressing her white privilege, and she did a roundtable with the girls from Scandal.
Oh,
Which,
did
yeah,
she?
you should totally watch it. It's really good. Complete side note. So I would love to, I'd love to know. I'd love for you to share with us two areas. So I'd love for you to share with us, what mistakes do you see business owners make when it comes to creating an inclusive environment with their business? I'd love you to point out some that are like glaringly obvious, and others that are a little bit more sneaky that maybe we don't aren't necessarily even privy to, that maybe we don't even realize that we're doing.
Okay, so the glaringly obvious one is when one is being performative. you know, at the height of the protests in America and globally, really in 2020, there was a lot of uproar, social media, people posting the black squares and, standing in solidarity. But that's as much as most people did. A vast majority just kind of moved on and have been silent about it. So that's being performative. When you just kind of pop on your feed when there's headline news, but you're not really doing any work on the surface. And maybe you're even the one recommending books, read this, read that, but you haven't touched anything. And that's what is called, virtuous signaling. You're putting out signals there so that people can see how, you know, affected you are, or that you're doing this work, but you're not. It's really performative because there's nothing underneath the surface. There's really no work that's been done. And so that's something that I've seen. And an example of that is through through, putting a scholarship really quickly onto your program so that you're making it accessible, but without knowing that I could put a scholarship program, but it could cause harm because I do not know how to hold space for the kind of people that I'm calling in to take on that scholarship. If I come into your space and you're completely void, you do not know the challenges, the setbacks, the barriers that I experience and that are going through. We can talk about mindset all day long, but if you're not understanding the system that is in place that has put barriers to ensure certain people do not move ahead, we're not going to make any progress. But when you have done your reading, your understanding, you're plugged into different resources, or even, have a DEI educator to support you, you are in such a better position to offer that support to, people of color, because you are doing the work. So that's where I have seen a glaring mistake, where people are saying, making my services accessible pricing, but you're not able to hold that space. So somebody leaves the experience of being in your group feeling worse than potentially when they started, and you feeling terrible because you're like, this person didn't even put in any effort. Like they hardly showed up. There was no engagement. I don't even know if this scholarship program should exist or if it's even working. I'm not feeling it. But it was premature. You hadn't done the work, you put it in, and you called in people who you couldn't hold space for.
Yeah.
So that's what's glaringly obvious. Do you want me to pause there before I go into more of the subtle?
No, no, I'm good. Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
I'm
So
agreeing here.
some of the subtle ways is when people think, oh, but I have people of color in my programs, and so that's fine. I don't really need to do this work because I'm attracting, I've got a handful here, a couple here. So that says that everything is cool. And also saying, oh, I studied this in uni, I studied a bit of inclusion work or diversity, or we did some programs in corporate. So you feel like, or yeah, I got an indigenous educator to come in, an aboriginal person came in and did a welcome to country, and so I'm being inclusive. Goodness me, that is nowhere close to doing the work that is required to hold spaces that allow people of color to feel safer in that space. And so those are the subtle ones where somebody kind of thinks they know, kind of thinks they're ahead because they have those things around them that indicate inclusivity. But in actual fact, it is not the case.
Okay, so they're really, really important points to bring to light. And so yes, you talked about like that first focus being the educational piece, and then what would you like to start to see that's different? What would you like to start to see people be doing?
What I'd love to see, and it's beginning slowly, people like, Julie Parker, who are really spearheading this industry and really disrupting and doing things differently to be inclusive, is I would love to see, particularly when it comes to group programs, where we are seeing more diverse educators coming into the mix. When I look at a lot of programs and I see, oh, we're getting guest experts, and you look at the lineup, coming back to what you said, Christine, who am I learning from?
Mm.
And you look at even the books on your shelf, and everybody is a white author, it will inform how you're learning. When you look at the people who you're inviting into your group programs as experts, if they're all white, again, that's a narrative that you're continuing to reaffirm, knowingly or unknowingly. The other thing is, if you're going to get people of color to come in and engage with your programs, don't just go for the DEI person. And that's the thing. That's the thing. I always get invited to podcasts or into programs. I'm like, don't forget, we don't just do DEI work. Not every single Black person is a DEI educator. In fact, far from it. A lot of people do not want to talk about this work because of how uncomfortable and really personal it is. And so there are people who are experts in sales and marketing and accountants and money and social media. We are in all spaces. It's bringing those people that you connect with. Of course, you want to bring people again who are heart aligned. You're really like-hearted, and you're like, yeah, they'll be a good fit for the company, and so on. But really looking at that, analyzing, when you're thinking of the programs that you're putting together, who can I bring to just add that lens as well? And also here really advocating for educating your clients, that when they come into your program, that they're touching a little bit on diversity, equity, and inclusion, that you're being that catalyst, that person who your program is so different. We're touching on things that are life matters, and maybe not just business, but also things that affect us. And that you're being that person who's opening that door, even though you're still doing the work, but you're creating that space for that knowledge to happen. So that's something that's powerful, that can begin to disrupt our industry that is still very white and is lacking representation.
Absolutely. Yeah, really powerful. I would love to know, like, is there any other like no-nos that you can point out as well? Like I think because I know that you've talked a little bit about I've seen with your socials and things like that, like no-nos with language or
Mm,
with imagery and things like that. Like I
wow.
remember like last year when there was a lot of attention on this. It's like the coaching industry, so many people were using the word tribe. And then that became like, even I had
Yeah.
an organization an events program that I ran that I was like, oh my God, I should not be using that word. Like,
Yes.
yeah, so we had to go and change it. Like, is there any other words like that that you think it's important to
There are a number of words that even I am still learning, to be quite honest, Christine. There are words I come across and I'm like, oh, I didn't know that was the history, and it came from this culture, and this is what it means, and that it's very wrong to use it. And I myself have used it. Language is so fluid, it is ever changing, and we can never be at a point where we know it all. It's a work in progress. And so what I did is create an inclusive language guide that just kind of breaks it down, particularly for those who are in the coaching industry, to go like, and tribe is one of the words on the list where I've said, this is why this word is inappropriate. And here are other words that you could use instead. And just giving the history of tribe. You see, I come from a tribe. I'm from the Kikuyu tribe in Kenya. It's one of the largest tribes there, and it's part of the Bantu clan. And, being part of a tribe is something that really it's ethnic. It is part of who we are as Kenyans. We have like what, almost 50 tribes now, and it makes up our identity and our customs and how we do things. And so taking that word and using it in a very different way than what it was intended, a lot of the times without understanding the history of it. And in fact, quickly switching gears to another word here was I had a question that came in my private Facebook group today, where Susan was asking me, Annie, digital blackface. I'm just having a little bit of trouble understanding when it comes to using imagery and what might be deemed, being digital blackface and potentially really causing harm. And for me, just diving a little bit deeper into that, which I do get into the guide itself, the inclusive language guide, and providing context, because before you even begin not using a word or feeling afraid of using the word and the impact that might have, it's so important to understand the historical context, and first starting with, what is blackface? Where did blackface originate from? What was the intention of it? And once you begin to understand the history behind that, when we get to present day where things have been digitalized, You have so much more of a deeper understanding when you see certain things, particularly in this digital era and social media, TikTok, the using of different voices and so on and so forth. You're a little bit more aware and you know what to kind of stay away from. And this kind of feels like, yep, this would be all right to use. But it's a constant evolution. It's a
Yeah.
constant growing. What was acceptable a year ago, probably not now, as we grow and learn and do better.
Yeah, because I saw recently Lizzo got caught up with a word that she used in a song and she had to change the song lyric. Did you see that?
Yes, yes, that was a slur that's quite ableist. And so
Yeah.
she quickly changed that into something that was more, universal. And
Mm.
so, yeah, it's something, even when you are an advocate for the things that you're saying shouldn't be happening, you can end up falling into that trap because things are ever evolving. And what seemed to be cool, or the words that we used that were okay, are not okay anymore.
Because I think it's also that we're so global now, right? Like it's not like you can just stay in your own little town and do your own thing because it's very visible. Like for Lizzo, it was okay for her to use that word in America because it meant a certain
Mhm.
thing. But in England and even Australia, we don't use that
We
word
don't
in a
use
nice
that.
way either.
No, no.
So yeah, it was really interesting to see that happen, and so she changed it very quickly. But I would love, like, even if you want to use that example, but like, what do you do if you do make a mistake? What is the best thing to do?
Yes, yes. If you do make a mistake, and again, in that inclusive language guide, which I think we should share with
I
your
will. I'll
people,
put it in the show notes for
I
sure.
have written a little paragraph there, what to do if you do make a mistake, because we are all open to making mistakes. Nobody is perfect. I think when you realize that you've made a mistake, it's acknowledging it and saying, oops, I messed up. I made a mistake. I am correcting that, and I am here to do better. Not a perfect human being. I think it's acknowledging it, and
Mm,
also being open to be called in. Not so much calling out, because I think calling out has the potential to really bring harm to people, depending on the context of it. But I think when you're called in, rather than going into defense mode, well, hang on, this word, we use it in America, so I don't know what y'all are talking about over there in Europe and Australia and Asia Pacific. This is cool here. I think it's, rather than being defensive, is listening, sincerely apologizing, and doing better, you know. And I think when you do that, when you do apologize, it's really hard to kick somebody when they're already down.
mm,
So being quick to listen and apologize is one way, knowing that this is a journey. We are all on it. There's no one who's far ahead, like I know it all and so on. I might be a coach in this space, but I'm constantly learning as well.
mm. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that guide. I think that's going to be really powerful for people. So I'll make sure that's in the show notes for sure. And so
Mhm.
you help business owners to really do this on a bigger scale, right? So you have a
Yeah.
program called Represented, and this goes into it a little bit more in depth. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, sure. Represented was really it stemmed from business owners who are feeling afraid. They don't know where to start with this work. They're feeling a little bit overwhelmed because there's so many options and they're not sure where to begin. They know they want to build a business that's racially equitable so they can be intentionally inclusive, but they're not knowing where to begin. And so Represented walks you step by step. It's a a 10-week program, and it's what I would like to call, as part of my framework, the awareness piece, because you cannot fix something unless you're aware of where the areas that you can't see, unless you're aware of your biases, the things that the prejudices that you hold. And so it walks you through step by step. And the beauty about Represented is permission to come as you are, permission to come messy, permission to come like I don't even know. I haven't done any reading, to be honest. I'm just coming here fresh, but I'm ready to learn and do it. And just holding a space with grace, holding a space where people, permission to make mistakes. But when you make a mistake, you learn and you do better. Not a place where you should have known better, Christine. Really, with the business that you have, come on. Not that kind of space, a space where, like, okay, what can we learn from this? How do we get up from here? Because we need everyone in this. work. This is not work that is just predominantly for, BIPOC to do. This is work that is needed for everyone to play a role. And I think it's so important that we make it in a way that it is work that we can lock arms together rather than saying it's them versus us. If we can lock arms together and do this work together with grace, with love, with kindness, I think we can make a lot of progress, Christine.
And so much progress, so much difference. Like, I think that that's where we need to be focused our attention. Yeah. Oh, so good, Annie. Thank you so much for sharing this with me today and for allowing us to dive deep into this topic. I know it can be a challenging conversation, but I think we handled it really beautifully. And I think that you bring such grace to it, and I knew you would, and just able to hold space. Because, like, I think that's one of the big things that's come out of here is like recognizing that you can't just be on show. It's got to be that space of holding and understanding and educating yourself to know that. So I really appreciate you, and thank you so much for coming on and sharing this with us.
Thank you for having me, Christine.
Amazing, Annie. Would you mind sharing with us how we can learn more from you, where to find you, where you hang out?
Yes, I mainly hang out on Instagram. Come check me out. My handle is Uplifting Studios TV. And you can also check out my website, upliftingstudios.com.au, and you will find everything you need to find out about me and what I do.
Amazing. I'll make sure I put all those links in the show notes so people can find them really easily. Please head to Instagram and share with Annie what you took away from this episode. It means so much to hear from you, to know that you're listening to this and you're taking powerful things away from it. So I really appreciate it.